It's not America's Top 40, but we're counting down the most downloaded episodes of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast for 2018. Welcome. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey everybody, welcome to a very special Facebook Live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Actually, it's sort of a strange deal. If you're watching this Facebook Live, you are getting a preview of the podcast that won't come out for a couple of weeks. But we're going to try this. We're going to try it again next week. And we're doing that with two very special episodes. If you've watched the podcast before, mostly listened to the podcast before, you know that usually I have a guest. Today, there is no guest. Today, you get me. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to count down the top 10 most downloaded, most watched and listened to episodes of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast of the year. And we're going to do it sort of, well, I'll get to that in a second. So first of all, let me just tell you a couple of things. So we've been doing the Remarkable Leadership Podcast for about 2.5 years. And so today we're going to talk only about the episodes that were created and first aired during 2018. And we've collected the data up through today, what is today? The 10th. Through the 10th. And without going into a bunch of technical stuff, there's a couple of ways that you could collect the data. We've got probably 98% of the data, so it's accurate. We have no tabulation from a prestigious accounting firm. I did the tabulation. So we have 10 episodes of this podcast, and we're going to do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're going to do it for folks who maybe haven't watched or listened before, so they might get excited and interested about some of these episodes. We want to give some love to some of these great guests that we've had on and their books and our episodes with them. And we're going to do all that right here, live on Facebook. And then later, it'll come out on our normal podcast sites, both audio and video. Another thing I want to do before we dive into the 10 is to make an observation, and that is of the 10, 7 of the guests were women. And I remember back to when we first started doing the podcast, we were probably 10 or 15 episodes in, and there'd only been one woman. And we got some feedback from some folks saying, hey, where are the women? And it was just a matter of who we had found at that time, and this, that, and the next thing. And I can tell you, 7 out of 10 women, 70% of the podcasts this year have not been women, so that's good. And we got some really, really smart folks, both men and women, to share with you today. Now, in the past, there still are these top 40 types of shows, counting down the top 40 songs of the week. Sort of channeling my inner Casey Kasem. But when Casey would do it, he would have long distance requests, which we don't have, dedications, but we don't have those. But what he'd also do is he would tell you a little story, and he would play you the whole song. I'm not going to tell you a little story and then play the entire podcast episode, because times 10 on an average of Marissa, 30 minutes probably, that'd be 300 minutes. You don't want that. You don't want 5 hours of podcast of live with me today. What you want is a short thing that gives you some idea. So here's what we're going to do. I really played with this because I don't want to give away the podcast so you don't listen to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about these 10, counting them down from number 10 to number 1. I'm going to give you a little bit about them. I'm going to tell you a little bit about maybe if you're trying to decide where to start or which ones to listen to, which things might be of interest to you. And let me tell you that all of these podcast episodes and every episode of the podcast can be found wherever you listen to podcasts or by going to remarkablepodcast.com. So with that, I'm going to try to channel My inner Casey Kasem. And we're going to now count them down from number 10 to number 1. Most downloaded and therefore listened to or watched podcasts of the year. Here we go. Number 10, coming in at number 10. This was episode number 86. It was released in January the 31st of 2018. And my guest was Andy Cunningham. It's a she, Andy the she. And that sounded pretty funny, Marissa, Andy the she. Anyway, this episode was titled What Leaders Must Know About Positioning with Andy Cunningham. And we talked about her book, Get to Aha, Discover Your Positioning DNA and Dominate Your Competition. So this book, I think, was a little different for us. It's a great book, and it was a great conversation that Andy and I had. It's different than most of our episodes because it really feels like it's a marketing book. And so all of us in an organization have a marketing, should have some thoughts about marketing. But really, this book probably you would think is most, and so therefore this podcast would be mostly for those interested in marketing. And of course, that would be true if that's the case for you. But let me tell you a little bit more about this. One of the things that Andy did was she worked on the launch for the original Mac. So we talked a little bit about that, and here was the big idea I got from that, which I thought was really great. I said, so what's the big thing that you learned from the Mac launch? And she said, well, that we had 60% agreement, but 100% buy-in. And as I recall it, she was talking about that in regards to any number of decisions that might be made around that launch and around that project. And that idea is a great idea, I think, for us as leaders to think about. That we want to get 100% commitment, but that doesn't mean we have to get everybody on board 100%. If we can have a team that really understands the vision of where we're headed, and if people are committed to the project, if we can get to 60% agreement and we can still get 100% buy-in, then we've really got something. First of all, we'll get more speed. But second of all, we'll really be creating the kind of team that we want to have. The other big idea that I got, one of the big ideas I got from Andy, was she talks about positioning in the marketplace as owning real estate in a prospect's mind, which as a business owner, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's a great way, I think, to think about positioning. It was one of the great things I got from her. In the book and in our podcast, we talked about 3 different kinds of positions that a company might have. And again, I don't want to go into everything that we talked about, but that would certainly be something worth getting from both the podcast and from the book, Get to Aha. I would say that this was a podcast about more than just marketing, because we talked about personal positioning as well. So if you are interested if you are a marketing leader, for sure. If you are interested in furthering your career, for sure. These would be 2 great reasons why you'd want to listen to this episode, the number 10th most listened to episodes of the year, What Leaders Must Know About Positioning with Andy Cunningham. That's number 10. Now, I have to also tell you, I don't have all the books with me for a variety of reasons. Some of the books I only had ebooks. Some of the books have been borrowed, and some of the books are probably in my home office. So if the authors are listening or watching, I do not want them to be upset because I can't show their book. And one of those is the next book. And so number 9 on our countdown was episode number 96. It came out in April the 11th to be specific. And it's titled, How You Learn is How You Live and Lead with Kay Peterson. Now this episode was great because it's probably the episode of the year where the entire focus was on learning. And I'm a big believer, well, let me back up. There are lots of episodes where learning is discussed this year, including some of those in the top 10. But this episode is about learning because Kay's book is titled How You Learn is How You Live, using 9 ways of learning to transform your life. And I spent a long time trying to get Kay to come on my show. She wasn't ready for a variety of reasons, but her book is great and she is great, and we had a great time on the podcast. We talked about different learning styles. We talked about how to apply those as a leader, how to use them for your own self-awareness, and how to be a more effective learner, of course, but also a more effective leader. The other interesting thing about this particular episode is that there's an assessment that we talk about during the episode that I was very aware of and familiar with an earlier version of this assessment. In fact, I've used it with clients in the past. But Kay's an expert, and there's a new version of the assessment. And so she had me take the assessment, and then she actually did coaching with me a few months before we did the podcast. So if you listen to this one, you're going to get some insights into Kevin, and we have some fun talking about that. But I'll tell you what, this is an episode about learning. If you want to figure out and learn how to be a more effective learner as a leader, this would be absolutely the episode you'd want to listen to. If you're a trainer or have any job in HR or OD, you would definitely want to listen to this. Or if you just want to learn more about your learning styles, this would be an episode. This is episode number 9 in our countdown. It's with Kay Peterson. It's titled "How You Learn is How You Live and Lead." It was great fun, and I hope that you'll take a chance to listen. Now, episode number 8 was with a gentleman named Chris McGough, and Chris McGough, and it was episode 110. Didn't come out until July, so July 18th. So let me just stop there for a second and think about this. You have episodes in July, long time to be listened to. You have an episode in April, less time to be downloaded. You have an episode in July, even less time to be downloaded. So I think it's kind of interesting when you get episodes that are later in the year that have less time to be downloaded. I think it's even more of a clue that you definitely want to take a listen. Now, this episode with Chris McGough, we talked about his book, and his book is titled "Match in the Root Cellar." Quite a title. How you can spark a peak performance culture. It's one of several books this year, including 3 on this list, where we talk a lot about culture. The interesting thing about Chris's book is it is a leadership parable for the longest portion of it. But the last section is what he calls a playbook, and the last section is sort of how to apply it all, and it's probably the last 20% of the book. So a lot of great stuff here, and we talked about the book, but we talked about a lot more during our podcast. Chris and I talked about 3 ways of being as it relates to how we show up then in culture. So we talked a lot about us as an individual and how we as individuals play into the culture that is created. Us as individuals, both as leaders and as individual team members. The 3 ways of being that he talks about are being integrity, being intentional, and being persistent. So we talked about those 3 things and a lot of other things. I'll tell you what, if Chris is a very fascinating guy, has an interesting background, and it's an interesting book, both in terms of what's in it and the way he created it. So if you're interested in organizational culture, especially how you as an individual, the role that you play in it, then you definitely want to listen to episode number 8 in our countdown, which again was Building a Peak Performance Organization with Chris McGough. Marissa, I wish we had sound where we could say, number 7. Oh, I guess I just did that. Number 7 is another book that I don't have the copy of with me, and because I've lent this book out, this is a great book. The episode number 7 is called "It All Matters" with Paul Cummings, and this was episode number 89. It came out on February the 21st of 2018. Of course, his book by it's a Wiley book, and it's entitled "It All Matters: 125 Strategies to Achieve Maximum Confidence, Clarity, Certainty, and Creativity." And the book captured me when I started reading it because of the personal story that he shares. When we started this podcast, we said that we wanted to have leadership experts and expert leaders. And sometimes you get really lucky and you get someone who's both. And while Paul is truly an expert leader, having built a great company, he is also a leadership expert because of some of the work that he does, and his expertise and his thought about all of this and about success and about confidence, clarity, certainty, and creativity shines through in this book, through the book and in our podcast. We had a great time on our conversation, and yes, there really are 125 strategies, and no, we did not talk about all 125 on the show, but we talked about several, including, and we talked about the meaning of success, and that's a topic that I think it's a word that has meaning for all of us, but maybe different meanings. And I think our conversation on that was great. And throughout the book and throughout the podcast, we talk a lot about his personal journey, which I think you'll find interesting. I would say that this book talks a lot about our role as a leader in creating the mindset that our team members need. It's our role as a leader in creating mindset as well as the mindset that we need ourselves. I think that one of the phrases that I remember from my conversation with Paul is that leadership is, well, he challenged us as leaders to leave things better than the way we found them each day. And I remember reflecting at the time about how when I'm cleaning up after delivering training at a site, people say, "Oh, we'll take care of that." And I always say, "Well, my mom taught me to leave the room as clean as when I found it." I clearly didn't listen to that in terms of my bedroom or even my office today. But I do try to do that in those situations. And it reminded me of that point. And I think Paul's point of, as leaders, leaving things better than we found them each day is a pretty powerful metaphor. And I think it gives you a sense about the practicality as well as the inspirational nature of he and I's conversation. So there's tons of content that we had in here. We didn't do 125 strategies, but we talked about a lot of them. So I'll just say this. If you are listening to this now or you're watching me now, you're going to like this particular episode because there's such a personal piece to this book that I think anyone who's been drawn to this podcast or drawn to our work is going to like this book and this podcast. And I would also say that there's a connected episode that didn't quite make this list. It's actually number 12 for the year, but really close to making number 10. It was episode number 95. It came out, I don't remember exactly when, but the author or my guest was Morton Hansen, and the title of the podcast was How to Be Great at Work. So if you found the episode with Paul or are interested in this episode with Paul Cummings, you'd want to listen to Morton Hansen when we talked about how to be great at work, because both of them take a very personal approach to all of this. So that's number 7. It All Matters with Paul Cummings. And now we're on to number 6. We're almost halfway done with the countdown, Marissa, and she's behind the camera going, "Oh, jeez. Kevin, can you just be done?" Okay, anyway, number 6. I do not have the book. I believe it's in my office at home. It is titled Leading Change Intelligently with Barbara Troutline. And this was episode number 100 of the podcast. It came out in May, on May the 9th specifically. We talked a lot about her book, which is entitled Change Intelligence, Using the Power of CQ to Lead Change That Sticks. And one of the things I remember about my conversation with Barbara is that it's clear that I liked it because we agreed. I suppose if I agree with the person, then I'm probably going to like the conversation. But no, we had very similar thoughts about the idea of how we make change really happen. And it requires to be doing more than just managing change, but to lead change. And this is what our conversation revolved around. We talked about the fact that 65% of major organizational changes fail. We talked about the reasons as to why it is and what the gaps are, and that the big gap is in the people side of the change, and that it's remembering that there's an emotional component to change and that people are involved in it. And we talked a lot about resistance and the nature of resistance. And one of the things that she challenged us all as who were listening to do was to reframe resistance from an enemy to an ally, which I thought was a very elegant and profound way to say that. And we talked about her ideas around change intelligence. We talked about the types of resistance of both in terms of, it reminded me of 4-H, even though there were only 3 H's, and that we often resist because of our head, that we don't understand the change. We often resist because of our heart, because we don't want the change. There's an emotional piece of it that we don't like or are scared of. And our hands, which is we're not sure we can do the change. And so great stuff with Barbara. And so if you are in the throes of an organizational change, or if you as a leader would like to be better at leading change, man, you would definitely want to listen to the 6th most downloaded episode of the year. It was with Barbara Troutline. It's titled Leading Change Intelligently. And we are now halfway through. We'll get to the top 5. And And the next one, and I have the book. So we're back to having the books. And this episode was with Constance Derricks, and the book is titled High Stakes Leadership, and that was the title of the podcast, High Stakes Leadership with Constance Derricks. Now, the full title, the subtitle of the book is Leading Through Crisis with Courage, Judgment, and Fortitude. So that title gives you a clue of what we talked about. We spent a lot of time talking about courage, judgment, and fortitude, which she believes are the overriding leadership characteristics that are transferable across all industries, cultures, and situations. So we talked a lot about crisis situations and leading through them, and then again we talked about those three ideas later in the episode. And I don't want to give too much away, but I will say that she considers courage to be about emotional energy that's required. She has a great definition of judgment, which talks about bringing our intellect to help support that courage and that emotion, and then with finesse, she uses to create courage with finesse. And then we talk about fortitude, which isn't force, but we talk about a whole formula that she has for that. So here's what I would say about our conversation: is it was extremely thought-provoking, and it was very practical, even though Constance comes from working with highly visible organizations on big, challenging situations. We had very practical kind of conversation in this episode. So I would say that if you are dealing with a merger or an acquisition, there's lots of great stuff here in our podcast as we talked about that, and we talked a lot about that in general. But we also talked about, as I said, some major leadership competencies, and the three that I mentioned earlier. So leaders in general are going to want to listen to this one, but especially if you are in the middle of or expecting to be involved in a merger or an acquisition on either side of that, this would be a great book, High Stakes Leadership, and a great podcast to listen to. The number 5th rated or downloaded episode of the year, High Stakes Leadership with Constance Derricks. Number 4 on the list is with Patty McCord. And Patty worked at Netflix early on, and she was hired by Reed Hastings to work at Netflix, and she was very involved in the creation of what you may have heard of as the Netflix Culture Deck. In fact, it's right here on the top of the book. Here is the book. The book is titled Powerful: Building a Culture of Freedom and Responsibility. But I guess I should give you the title of the podcast episode. It is with Patty McCord. It was episode number 83 from, and I got the date wrong here in my notes, I know, but it was episode number 83, and it's titled Building a Powerful Culture with Patty McCord. And so for many, many years, Patty worked in the HR world. She was the HR director, among other things, at Netflix. She also considered herself to be the COO of the culture at Netflix for a number of years. We talked a lot about culture. And while she has an HR background, she's not the typical HR person. We talked about that early on. So if you're interested in the history of Netflix, we spent a little bit of time there because it's kind of interesting stuff. But we talked a lot about culture. And she says, I think insightfully, that culture is something that you can never stop working on. And so we spent a lot of time on that. Also, because culture comes from the folks that you have on the team, we talked a lot about interviewing and how you can do a better job of interviewing to bring the right people onto your team to help you to nurture and support and grow, maintain the culture that you want. So if you are interested in organizational culture, and especially if you're interested in building a team around the culture that you're trying to create, then this is a must listen. And I said that I've already talked about the Chris McGough book earlier about culture, but I also would say that episode 123, titled The Power of Corporate Culture with Chris Dyer, would be worth listening to. So there's 3 episodes in the last few months where we talked about culture. So I really enjoyed my conversation with Patty. I think it was enjoyable for me. And I always say that if it was enjoyable for me, probably others are going to like it as well. But again, it was episode number 4, and it was called, I lost it, Building a Powerful Culture with Patty McCord, and we talked about her book, Powerful. It's number 4. We have 3 more to go. We have 2 more women and 1 more man, and the man is sandwiched in between the 2 women. Next one was, I had a guest, one of the co-authors of a book, and this episode came out last February. It's episode number 90. Kind of interesting that we had episodes number 89 and 90 and right in a row. And in fact, as a little bit of a spoiler alert, the number 1 episode is in episode number 91. So we were on a pretty good roll back there at that point in the year. But right at the end of February, I had Amma Marston on, who wrote this book titled Type R, Transformative Resilience for Thriving in a Turbulent World. I'm guessing your world is turbulent. Amma co-wrote this book with her mother, Stephanie, and the title of the episode is Leadership Resilience with Amma Marsden. I actually think of this as the resilience episode, and we talked about resilience. We talked about bouncing back from things, about what do we do in the moment of trauma or stress to create something better. So it's not just trying to get through those moments, whether they are personally or professionally, but how can we learn from them, not only later in reflection, but as we go through them. And there's some really powerful stuff. I will tell you, too, that I don't remember how much we talked about this on the episode, but I know in the book, both she and her mother tell stories about their own personal stories of adversity and the need for resilience, and it sets the book up very well. One of the things that we talked about in the episode were the 6 skill sets that they talk about as being what it takes to be a type R person, or a person with high resilience. And so those skill sets, just quickly, without going into any of the depth that you do, because you're going to want to go listen, those 6 skill sets are adaptability and having a healthy relationship with control, which as a leadership coach I can tell you not everybody does, to be a continual learner, which I'm a huge fan of, to have a sense of purpose, to leverage the support of people around you, and to have active engagement in what's going on around you. So we talked about those 6 skill sets in some detail. And so I would say that if you are working through any sort of tough situation at work, or have been through one and feel like you didn't maybe benefit from it in any way, that it just was tough and then it was over, then I would really think you'll want to listen to this episode. It's episode number, I lost the page. It's episode number 90 from last February, Leadership Resilience. And so strongly recommend you take a look at the episode and the book. In August, actually in May, I had a conversation with one of my heroes, and that episode came out on the 1st of August. It was episode number 112, and so it's the number 2 episode of the year. It didn't come out until August, so that should say something about it. And maybe it says something about the guest, who, as I said, is one of my heroes, and I told him as much on the episode. The guest was Tom Peters, and we talked about his newest book called The Excellence Dividend. And so the episode is called, shockingly, The Excellence Dividend with Tom Peters. So we talked about this book, his latest book, a book that people told him that he needed to write, he was compelled to write. And if you've never read Tom, this is the way his books look inside. Lots of bold, lots of stuff going on in them. And that's the way he talks. He talks with a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. He talks in short bursts. And so this was an episode where we talked about excellence. This is an episode where we told stories, and I let him tell stories, and I encouraged him to tell stories. And this is an episode where I let Tom be Tom, not that I probably could have stopped him even if I'd have wanted to. And so this is his most recent book. If we were to turn that camera around, which Marissa's not going to do, you'd see on a shelf behind me that are much like these shelves here, there's about a half a shelf filled with Tom Peters books, because I've read pretty much everything he's written in the last 36 years. And so I was super excited to have him on. It was great to have him on. We talked about all kinds of stuff. Even though Tom has been at this for 30 some years, and he's older than me, he's still thinking forward. And so we talk a lot about what he calls the tech tsunami. We talk about artificial intelligence and robotics and that sort of stuff and the implications of all that for business and for leaders. We talk about training. We talked about relationships. We talked about a whole bunch of different stuff. So I would tell you this, that if you've never heard of Tom Peters or read one of his books, you want to listen to this episode. It's like getting you associated with and connected to one of the most seminal thinkers about business and leadership in the world in the last 35 years. But if you're a fan of Tom, you've already stopped and gone to download it. But if you're a fan of Tom, you're going to definitely want to listen. And if nothing else, you get to see Kevin go a little bit fanboy during part of the episode. Again, it's episode number 112 from early August. It's The Excellence Dividend with Tom Peters. And now, if I were Casey Kasem, we'd go to commercial because we don't build up the suspense for number one. So I'm kind of going to do that. And what I'm going to do is to say that before we get to number one, that there were a bunch of episodes this year, right? And if you've not listened to any, you might want to, if this is your first, you might want to go back. And hopefully this episode is meant to give you some great jumping in points. But man, there's been a lot of good stuff that we've done this year. There's been a number of great episodes in the last 90 days that just haven't been out long enough to have made this list. We've had great, big, mega best-selling authors like Seth Godin and Jeffrey Gitomer, neither of whom made this list. If I could have a list of podcast guests for the year and not have Jeffrey Gitomer or Seth Godin make it, that says something about the quality of the folks that we've been blessed to have on the show. So I challenge you to go back and take a listen. And with that, I guess that's enough suspense. I'll get you to the number one most downloaded episode of the year. It was recorded last December, about 12 months ago, as I'm recording this now. But it didn't come out until March the 7th. It's the 91st episode of the podcast, the third in a row that we're in this top 10. The episode is titled "Creating Leadership Flex" with Jane Yoon, and it's based on our conversation. The jumping off point was her book that she wrote with Audrey Lee, and it's titled Flex, and the subtitle is The New Playbook for Managing Across Differences. And I can tell you that when I first got this book in the mail, when it was being pitched for us to do, I saw Managing Across Differences, and I started looking in, and I said, oh, this is a book on diversity. And that's so, not that is not an important topic, but I felt like it was a topic that had been done 100 times. Well, Jane and I get at that point late in the podcast that this isn't just another book about diversity, and this isn't a book about making sure that we're in compliance and doing our due diligence around diversity. This is a book about being able as a leader to flex and to lead differently based on those folks on our team, based on more than just cultural differences, but on style differences and many other things. We talked about her idea of cultural fluency, which is a great idea, and I don't want to give it away because I really hope you'll go take a listen. We talked about flexing as a leader in terms of our style. There's a lot of great stuff in our conversation. We talked about the power gap or the power difference between us and those we lead, and how do we navigate that a little more elegantly and a little more successfully, even though it's a truism, right? It's true that there's a power gap. And as I would said, if you are thinking that this is an episode about diversity at its sort of starting point, it's way beyond that. This is a book about helping us as leaders and us as teams get better. Because when we can bring diverse folks together with different skills, experiences, and backgrounds together and really utilize their time and their talents and their different experiences and perspectives, then we can create new synergy that we would never otherwise get. That's what this book is about. This is what our conversation is about. If you are interested in leadership development in general, or if you're interested in team building, this is a book that you would want to listen, that you would want to get, and this is a podcast that you would want to listen to. So there we go. I have counted down the top 10 most downloaded episodes of 2018 in a very different kind of podcast and a very different starting point by doing it first live on Facebook right here from one end of my office here at Remarkable House. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found this engaging. I hope that more than anything, this has led you to say, I got some podcasts to go listen to. As you think about that, some of these, very few of these, but a few might be available on YouTube as video. A few are available on video on remarkablepodcast.com. But moving forward into next year, they're going to be on video, pretty much all of them. And in fact, if you'd rather watch than listen, you can go to iTunes and you can get the video version of all future episodes. Even though not all these will be there, all future episodes will be on video. And we're going to try some more stuff on Facebook, including next week when we do the first episode of 2019, the episode where I talk about what I learned from doing these podcasts throughout 2018. I'll be back here next week for Facebook. I'll be back here next week for the podcast. You have been listening to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and I'll be back next week and every week. Come back and join me, won't you?